The woman in the other world told him to bring the fruits of summer to the outer world outside, so he could tell them he had been in the other world. Bring the fruits of summer with you, said the woman. So he brought wild garlic with him, and primroses and buttercups. It's very interesting that this sort of otherworldly inversion that we've seen to some degree in the solar symbolism is also alluded to in the early 13th century history of the Danes of Saxo Grammaticus, where the king, Hadingus, is approached at supper by a woman bearing hemlock. And in inviting him to see what part of the world such fresh plants might grow in winter, she envelops him in her cloak, and they vanish away beneath the earth. They both find themselves in a sunny otherworld region where such herbs grew. This inversion in references to the otherworld is something I think we can pursue archaeologically. We've seen it, as I said, in the solar imagery, particularly in the binary opposition of pairs of objects, like the discs on the Petrie crown and the Monasterevan type discs already mentioned. But it occurs elsewhere as well. In the very famous Iron Age Hallstatt grave at Hochdorf, this individual, whom we'll visit again later on, was buried with the highest status symbols of the elites of the early Iron Age. As you can see, he was placed on a wagon with various gold ornaments. But it's his shoes I simply want to focus on at this stage. The shoes had probably been of leather, but they had perished, but the gold mounts that had been placed on them survived. And it was very clear from the shape of the gold mounts that the right shoe had been placed on the left foot, and vice versa. And the archaeologist Ulrich Veit noted how the inversion of grave goods might indeed represent the passing of a person from this world to what he described as an upside-down world. And Eugene Vaubenbal too has remarked that it's unlikely that the placing of these shoes on the wrong feet was a mistake in this highly ritualized context. And he draws attention to Hittite mythology, where the god of fertility and agriculture, Telepino, disappears in winter, having put his sandals on the wrong feet. Telepino undergoes a symbolic death and spends a time in the land of the dead, and this has a predictable negative effect on nature until he's located and brought back to this world. And there may be an echo of this in some of the Slavonic folklore, where malevolent demon gods, spirits of the forest, the Leshy, they're particularly active in spring after dying in autumn like the leaves on the trees amongst which they lived. But their style of dress included clothing worn back to front and shoes worn on the wrong feet. Now, I must confess, there's a huge distance in every sense of the word between an ancient Anatolian myth, European folklore on shoes, and indeed the fruits of summer from Uina Goth. But I think we're beginning to see a pattern here. And there is an obvious difference, I suppose, between the wearing of shoes on the wrong feet and the wearing of just one shoe. But if you think about it, wearing one shoe and leaving one foot unshod is possibly another version of this rite. And in medieval Ireland, as some will recall, royal inauguration ceremonies included the rite of the single shoe, in which a single shoe was a very emblematic item to toss or wave or place at one of these medieval inauguration ceremonies. And there are various references in Irish literature to otherworld figures associated with a single piece of footwear. For example, there's one of the supernatural Tuatha De Danann, who alternated the golden sandal so that each of your feet had the turn of it. Another otherworldly figure recorded by Princess Macana also wore one golden sandal, which as he walked was on whichever foot touched the ground. Yet another wore a silver sandal, and yet another wore a silver sandal on his left foot and a golden one on his right. There's something very peculiar happening here. Macana actually suggested that this motif may in some way be related to the Indian taboo that prohibited a king from treading on the ground, lest his potency be drained away into the earth. But in any event, in early Irish tradition, this peculiar notion of one shoe or alternating shoes or reversed shoes clearly carries supernatural associations. This rite of monosandalism, as some continental scholars call it, is well known in classical literature and in classical art, and this is simply a sort of a replica of a statue of Mercury, shown with one foot shod and one foot unshod. This is a French discovery, and it seems to be a depiction of Mercury in his role as the guide of souls, escorting the dead to the other world. And very often where you get depictions of this monosandalism, you are dealing with events that seem to be marking some sort of transition in whatever depiction they occur. And this is just like the case of the Hockdorf body being prepared for his journey to the other world. It's interesting too at Hockdorf, by the way, that you remember I mentioned at Vix that the wagon bore this solar decorations in small bronze plaques where you had birds' heads above and below the solar disc. It's very hard to see on the Hockdorf couch on which the corpse rested, but ringed in red there at either end of the decorative panel, that's such a striking feature of the rear of this very strange object, you have small birds' heads. And even though these are miniature versions, I don't think for a moment we should underestimate their significance to those who engraved them and those who were aware of their existence. A connection with birds and the other world is something we come across again and again. And indeed, you may recall we came across it in the very first lecture in that birth tale of Cuchulainn, when those birds ravaged the land around Auanmacha. Half a millennium earlier, you also find traces of this otherworldly inversion in a series of commemorative stelae in southwestern Iberia. These are engraved with schematic motions, including stylized figures of warriors, as you can see. Swords, spears, and chariots, and circular shields all occur. And it's very clear that the shields are often shown from the rear. The boss isn't shown, but as you can clearly see on this example, the grip on the handle of the shield is visible and clearly depicted. Marian Uckelman, in her splendid study of European shields, sees this back-to-front view as one from a shield bearer's perspective and a means of expressing the protective purpose of these objects rather than their offensive role. Thus, the stone may have been a territorial marker, presenting an offer of protection and safety. But I think there may be another and related meaning as well. The shield is reversed because the dead warrior presumably belongs to the other world, and the occasional depiction of the sword on the warrior's right, rather than on the left as you might expect in a right-handed person, may be another expression of this reversal. I think the fact that you have an otherworldly warrior represented reinforces the protective purpose of stones such as these. It's interesting that some Hallstatt swords in male graves in France and Germany have also been found inverted on the body, the point towards the head, the hilt towards the feet. And such rites of reversal have been noted in several English Iron Age burials as well. The iron spines of some shields, for example, have been found placed downwards in the grave, suggesting inversion. And indeed, in one of the famous Yorkshire graves at Kirkburn, a coat of chain mail had been placed on the body of an individual buried in a chariot burial. It had been laid upside down and back to front. And a warrior burial near that shrine at Mill Hill in Deal that I mentioned also contained a man buried with shield and iron sword, and the scabbard had been placed face down in an inverted position. I think careful scrutiny of other funerary evidence might provide us with more clues for a deeply rooted and widespread concept of an inverted otherworld. And it might even be reflected close to home in the widespread practice of inverting pottery vessels in Bronze Age burials. In the National Museum of Scotland, they have a fine display of a number of urns, all placed in the display cabinet, as they should be, upside down in an inverted position. In many graves in Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales, and indeed even in some late Bronze Age burials in continental Europe too, you have this repetitive inversion of pottery vessels, sometimes containing cremated bone, but sometimes not, simply placed upside down in the grave. And finally, we should be alert perhaps to the fact, and I'm a little more tentative about this, that the journey to an inverted otherworld might conceivably be reflected in grave architecture as well. This suggestion was prompted by the fact that a number of pre-Christian migration period graves at Silta, north of Stockholm, were carefully covered with stone packing. And this packing was carefully laid in a counter-clockwise direction, the reversal of the norm, as you know, and like reversed footwear, perhaps an allusion to the other world. You remember that the unfortunate Boand went counterclockwise around the well of Necton. And this sort of anti-clockwise construction, as noted in the Silta packing, may conceivably occur elsewhere as well. As I said, I'm rather tentative about this, but one Bronze Age kist grave from County Roscommon had its stones placed, as the discoverer pointed out, in cyclical fashion. Now, there could be simple constructional explanations for this, but in most cases when these graves have been examined, it has either not been done or it has not been possible to do to determine the sequence in which the stones were laid. But if they were consistently laid in a counterclockwise fashion, then perhaps grave architecture, as I said, might be referencing the other world as well. In a discussion of the Silta phenomenon, a Swedish scholar, Andreas Nordberg, drew an interesting connection between some funerary practices and the need to perform some actions backwards, upside down, or contrary to the course of the sun. And as I said, remember the unfortunate goddess Boand. Nordberg reminds us that death too was a cosmic drama, altering human existence in fundamental ways. And he instances, and I think this is quite fascinating, a scene in one of those very famous Gotland picture stones, in which, as you can see, Odin's eight-legged horse, Sleipnir, is carrying a fallen warrior on his back to Valhalla. But behind Odin's horse, there's a procession of three men walking backwards and carrying their swords inverted with the points facing downwards. And I wonder, could it be that some of the footprints and processional scenes in Bronze Age Scandinavian rock art, for example, are not meant to represent people walking forward, but people walking backwards? You can see how, in fact, Irish tradition allows us to think, I think, in slightly different ways about many archaeological things. And while the darker aspects of the other world and the malevolent creatures are very much a part of the Uine Goth story, a belief in a very different, inverted otherworld was very prominent too. One great Celtic scholar, Theo Ferrali, once said that the other world is impervious to archaeological exploration. And he was very critical of archaeologists who, as he put it, were by nature optimists and were tempted to wander into unfamiliar fields. Now, I grant you that the other world, by definition, has no material existence, but there were those for whom it was a reality, and I think archaeology does have the capability to identify some past processes and practices that have left us some material evidence, as you can see, of a belief that was probably a very fluid concept, but in some respects represented an inverted mirror world. And like that belief in the celestial and nocturnal voice of the sun, we may have an illustration here of another very ancient European concept. And solar imagery, grave goods, and grave architecture may suggest that this inverted otherworld is not beyond our ken, archaeologically speaking.